Much of that. I'm sure you're all wondering when I'm going to settle down and do something serious, get a steady job for a change. I have an outline here of what I'm going to speak about tonight, and perhaps if I just pointed out the topics, then it'll be easier to follow what I'm saying. I find my wife has contributed a lot to the talk tonight, and this is her first contribution to the outline. So I haven't called it Germans, but Germanics. Because, well, I'll get into that. The first point is, what are Germanics? What is Germania? Then, at the top, we'll have a historical sketch giving you the background of the extent of Germany and something of why it occupied so much space and why it changed its boundaries. Third, the migrations of Germans in Europe and the migrations to America. Fourth, I've got so many relatives here tonight, I'll get lynched if I don't say something about Alsace and Lorraine. Fifthly, Germanic culture and life in the old country. Finally, we probably will run out of time, but I've written out this tracing family history, and I'll leave it with Mark. This is the actual introduction to my talk. I wanted to say that it's taken me 50 years to come full circle. My very first talk in public was given about 1940 when Miss Swinton, my public school teacher, dragged me over to a school teachers meeting at SS number 2. My project then concerned William Penn and the Pennsylvania Dutch. It couldn't have been very exciting because nobody asked me back. Tonight, for my second appearance in Willoughby, my subject is quite a bit broader. Penn and his Dutchmen are still mentioned, but I assure you I've learned a bit more about them since the age of 10. First off, I want to speak about the Germanics, where they came from, what their homelands and they were like, and why they came. By Germanic people, I mean those whose mother tongue was German or a version of that language. And before going any farther, I want to ask 3 questions. How many of you here tonight know or suspect that you have Germanic ancestry? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Golly, it's practically half the crowd, and the crowd's about 40 people. So you can see of course, we've got to take into granted there are too many Rooks here, but there are a lot of Germanics. Do any of you remember German being spoken at home by your grandfathers, or there's another 10, say. So, and I know that my father spoke German, so there are quite a few who maintained the tradition over several generations. You may well say, why speak about Germanics at all? And the answer is because they and their descendants formed a very large proportion of the North American population. So many people with a similar cultural background must have affected the character of our 2 countries. Certainly, they contributed in no small measure to our national development. In Canada alone, they form the 3rd largest group of our people, ranking only after those of British and French descent. Willoughby had more than the average. In the 1881 census, for example, by my count last week, 874 people out of 1,273 were clearly of German birth or descent. That was 69% of the population. So in a crowd of any 10 people, 7 had some German background, either through their mothers or fathers. And there were probably more than that because the mother's descent didn't count for anything except for her in the census. If you were the child of a German father or father of German descent, you were German descent. Didn't matter if your mother was Russian or Chinese. So there were probably more than, say, 70% that had some German in them way back. And among the Germanics were the groups we call Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch, Alsatian, Austrian, and Swiss. And there were also German-speaking people from Czechoslovakia, Flanders, Hungary, Luxembourg, Poland, and the 3 Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and some from Russia and the Balkans, for instance, Yugoslavia. Most of my examples will come from Alsace and the German Palatinate, because I've done more research on that area. But many of my observations apply just as well to other places. How did it come about that people in so many places spoke German, and why did they emigrate from there? To answer this, we have to have a bit of history and a map. On the far side here, I have a map of Central Europe from Spain to the east. Going as far as about Poland. The Germanic tribes, there were quite a few of them, came from the east and the south. And by the time of Christ, they had reached this area in here. Now this is the Rhine River, and this is the Danube River. Going over here to the sea over here. They had advanced as far. The Roman Empire actually extended over a vast area and included some of England. But when the Germanic tribes here, they encountered the Romans, who had lined up close to the Rhine River. They had all this. And the Romans were pushing the Germans back until they reached a point somewhere over here, just in the year 9 AD. Hermann, the leader of the German tribes, defeated the Romans. And this was a massive defeat for the Romans because up to that time, none of these barbarians had been able to hold the Romans back. So from then on, the Romans held the line along the Danube, the Rhine. They actually built a wall across here to the Danube, and they held what would be today Austria and France, while the Germans stayed here. Finally, as the Roman power decayed, the Germans pushed the Romans back here and south into Italy. Eventually, by about the year 800, the Germanic Empire extended from the border of Spain clear over here to this green line, which is the east of Saxony, down like this. Now, the man who had done the most to conquer these lands was the king of the German tribe called the Franks. He was Charlemagne, and for centuries he was the greatest of their kings. He had gone south into Italy, and I think at the request of the Pope, had driven the barbarians out and brought a state of peace to the North Italian areas. And in return for that, he was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, the first of the Holy Roman Emperors And from then on, this great extent of German Empire slowly changed its shape. Nobody for years afterward was nearly as powerful as Charlemagne. And it kept being divided up. This part, I'll talk a great deal about later. So we're on to the well, I've gone through ancient history, and I've come up to medieval times. For 1,000 years after Charlemagne, his successors became divided. The empire became divided and went through many changes. Germany did not become a unified nation until long after France and England had done so. You should look at a colored map showing German lands as they were a few centuries ago. Could I have that first map, please? I don't have a map of all of Germany, but I have a map of Alsace, which, as you see, it borders the right hand, the east side of it borders on the Rhine River. These are the lordships, the various areas ruled over by individual lords. This lower part, with the horizontal stripes, was actually in the hands of the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor himself. But you can see how crazily divided the whole map of Europe, of Germany, at that time is the craziest patchwork quilt you ever saw. It's if you fly over Ontario, you see a very neat grid of squares of our concession lines and our various township lines and the farms. It all looks, well, in our flatlands, it's very neat. That is a maze of lordships of all shapes and sizes. There were more independent and semi-independent principalities and cities than there are days of the year. Each unit might have its own government, laws, taxes, customs duties, and many had their own armies and currency. There were innumerable differences in standards among these, so trade and travel across the country was a headache. There were constant squabbles over boundaries, legal rights, and successions. And when Luther's criticisms of the current corruption of the Catholic Church sparked the Protestant Reformation, it gave a splendid new excuse for princes to seize land and wealth and go to war with each other. Although the Holy Roman Emperorship eventually became an elected office, it once again tended to become hereditary in one family. There were 7 great German princes who were called electors because, on the death of an emperor, they had the duty of electing the new emperor. There wasn't any such thing as one person, one vote. It was 7 votes. To maintain their own power and independence, it was necessary for the electors to put in weak or powerless emperors. And from the 16th century on, they favored the Austrian Habsburg family because it had only its own small ancestral territory to rely on. It could never by itself be a threat to the great lords and would be beholden to them for being elected to the emperor's office. And before the electors would elect anyone, that man had to reach terms of a compromise with them on the sharing of powers and privileges. This way they could keep the emperor from becoming too powerful and lording it over them. Once again, I come to closer to modern times. Napoleon degraded the prestige of the empire and the power of the Habsburg emperor. And perhaps I'd better go over and indicate again the changes in the extent of the lands. Even though the emperor was a fairly powerless man, he had the prestige of being the emperor, and the German states, no matter how divided they were, owed him some allegiance. When Napoleon and the French became the prevailing power in Europe, Napoleon wanted to become an emperor himself, and he could become emperor of the French, but he did not want to be subservient to the older emperor, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And so he forced the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to divest himself of claims to the Holy Roman Empire and become merely the emperor of Austro-Hungary, the lands that are shaded in purple here, about like that. And some of these lands here were semi-independent. But you can see from a large area over which the Holy Roman Empire still extended, it was cut down to probably less than half its size. Those were the Germanic states in the south. The states in the north were still divided for another 40 or 50 years until they could reach a compromise themselves. And they elected their own emperor, and he was from the powerful Hohenzollern family that were already kings of Prussia. And this was the extent of their empire up until about the time of the First World War. This may not look very large on the map, but that's in contrast to what the Holy Roman Empire originally had been. From now on, I'll refer to this map here, where it's easier to spot individual countries by their color. Can you show the migrations overhead? I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible, get down to the good stuff. I had to put them on a sheet like this because there are so many groups, and unless we can have something to refer back to, we get completely lost. First of all, the Germanics migrated within Europe from country to country. Secondly, the second division under that is the Germanics coming to North America. And the first large section under that is those migrations caused by the American Revolution, those that came around 1800, those that came in the 1830s, and then those that were caused by world wars. So we have, from top to bottom again, the American Revolution. We had Hessians who landed for Loyalists around 1800. We had the Mennonites, Swiss soldiers, market pioneers. Then our large group of Alsatians who came in the 1830s, and finally those from Eastern Europe, the victims of communist revolutions, as well as the German defeat. those, I have to talk about migrations inside Europe, because that explains why you get Germans coming from all these other countries that you don't think of as being Germanic. So, for instance, Yugoslavia or Poland. In the Middle Ages, after the Crusades were over, the Order of Teutonic Knights turned away from the Holy Land toward Eastern Europe and moved into lands held by pagan tribes. Their goal was to subdue and Christianize the people, to claim and to settle the lands. German nobles were granted estates, and they in turn brought in more of their countrymen to manage and develop large farms. Thus, Prussia became almost wholly German, and the Baltic states received German governing and managing classes. About 1800, when Russia opened up territories in its south and west for more efficient agricultural development, German settlers and farmers were invited in. During the 19th century, when underdeveloped Central European and Balkan countries wanted new industrial plants built and the managerial people to run them, the financiers, skilled and educated staff were brought in from Germany, and these prosperous foreign newcomers were resented by the local populations. Hostility toward them continued into the succeeding generations. Now, although the Germanic nations divided into two empires, the empires were already beginning to decay. Ethnic movements in the small member countries were agitating for independence. While the proportion varied among them, considerable numbers of their noble, industrial, and merchant classes were of German descent. The bulk of the peasants were of local ethnic origin. Eventually, after World War I, both empires collapsed, the emperors were deposed, and then the imperial dominions were disbanded. These became independent countries, and after World War II, many of these nations, such as Czechoslovakia and Hungary, experienced communist revolutions in the name of ethnic native peoples. And these were getting their own back now, and they victimized their more prosperous citizens and dispossessed them, Germanics included. Although the impoverished German minorities considered themselves as citizens of those countries, many sought refuge in West Germany and Austria. Thus, lands which had been invaded, settled, and Christianized by the Germans up to 500 years earlier were ethnicized once more. And now we can turn at last to Canadian immigration. There have been waves of Germanic immigration to North America from the 1600s on. Some, such as the early Dutch, came primarily to settle new colonies. Others were refugees from wars, famine, persecution, or general hard times in the old countries. And I've already mentioned the groups they include: Pennsylvania Dutch, Alsatians, Austrians, Swiss, and later on from the smaller countries. The German groups that came to Canada, I can give a little bit more information about. The first big influx of Germanics into Canada was caused by the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. One was a group of German soldiers called the Hessians, who settled in Canada after the peace of 1783. They were mostly disbanded soldiers who had been sent in regiments from Germany to Canada to support the British forces. They settled in Quebec and Eastern Ontario. These Hessians came from several principalities and about here in central Germany. They were distinctly different principalities, so each regiment had a different provincial name. Did I say most of these people settled in Eastern Ontario and Quebec, because that's where they were stationed during the war. Far more numerous were the United Empire Loyalists, which included a large proportion of descendants of the Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch, and German Palatine pioneers. As we know, the Dutch had already come from the Netherlands to be the first settlers of New York, or New Netherlands as it was then called, in the early 1600s. The original Pennsylvania Dutch, on the other hand, were not Dutch at all, but actually German pacifists, somewhat like Quakers, who William Penn had invited over in the 1680s to found Germantown near his Quaker colony at Philadelphia. About the Palatines, it's necessary to say a good deal more, because the term continued to be used for a long time and covered a great many people, but it became an old-fashioned word in the 1800s, and these people tended to be lumped together under the all-purpose term, the Pennsylvania Dutch. Dutch, of course, is from, well, the Germans call themselves Deutsch. That means Germans. But it looks like Dutch in English, so they're Dutch. The original Palatines were German Protestants, refugees from wars, religious persecution, and economic hardship. Queen Anne had heard that they were being persecuted in the Palatinate, which was true. And she, as defender of the faith, offered them her protection. She invited them all to England. And so many of them came to England. They say, some experts say there were between 7,000 and 8,000 landed on her doorstep. And the British government got tired of feeding these people on relief and shipped half of them out to New York State, where they could work on government projects in the forests, in the pine forests of the Hudson Valley. The idea was that they could tap the trees for sap, boil it down into tar, and then cut down the tall timber for lumber, which is badly needed for the British ships. In this way, the British could get cheap lumber and tar for caulking for the British Navy and stop sending a lot of money to buy expensive timber products from Sweden and Norway and the Baltic countries. It didn't work, and within 2 years everybody went broke, so they moved out into into farming. Those people came to New York in 1709 and 1710, and my mother's people, the Hendershots, come from a family that came out at that time, and I'm sure that there are other people in Willoughby who's came up as Loyalists and had Palatine ancestors. The rosy prospects for immigrants in the New World, especially in Pennsylvania, seemed so good that thousands of additional Germans from other provinces, whether they were oppressed or not, whether they were Protestant or Catholic, or just restless, joined the emigration. And everybody just referred to these people as Palatines. The first group they had were Palatines. Everybody else that came was called a Palatine, just like we called every foreigner that came into the country a DP back after 1945. At one point during the French and Indian Wars in the middle 18th century, the government was worried about bringing so many of these foreigners to Pennsylvania. So they diverted some shiploads of German immigrants to Nova Scotia in 1755, and they settled what is now called Lunenburg County. The tide of Germanics to this continent has continued ever since, abating only during times of war or economic prosperity in Europe. We haven't seen many Germans lately, but I'm sure we'll see some of the East Germans before long. There's so many of them coming out. Many of the Palatines and descendants of the early Pennsylvania Dutch honored the British monarchy for having given their ancestors assistance, protection, freedom of religion, and access to new lands. They remained steadfastly loyal during the Revolution and served in Loyalist regiments. In fact, the 60th Regiment, which is called the Royal Americans, consisted largely of German-speaking men many from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. When they were forced to leave their American homes when the rebels won, many friends, relatives, and dependents came with the disbanded soldiers to settle here. A number of such people received early land grants in Lincoln and Welland counties. German names that occur in Michael Gonder's list of early settlers in Willoughby are Ashbaugh, Gonder, House, that's George House, Miller, John Miller, Morningstar, and the Wintermutes. Of the Loyalists, for example, George House had served in Butler's Rangers, and the Wintermutes had had a fortified farmhouse on the Susquehanna River to which local Loyalists fled for protection. Again, there are the Alsatians and Swiss. Some of these people arrived with the so-called Palatines in the 1700s. But there were particular reasons for later migrations in larger numbers. The Alsatians, like the Palatines, lived in the Rhine Valley. It was a buffer zone between larger warring states. Consequently, it suffered badly at the hands of marauding armies. This is the boundary between France and Germany, and it follows the Rhine River. This is Alsace right here in France. This is the Palatinate, now let's see, around Heidelberg. Over here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. This is the Palatinate over here, almost directly opposite Alsace. During the 30 Years' War, which afterwards, until 1914, the 30 Years' War of the early 1600s was always called the Great War in Europe, because they'd never seen anything like it. After all, a lot of people who were born during the war and reached maturity and were fighting at the age of 30 hadn't been alive at the beginning of the war. It's very involved, but briefly it was Protestants against Catholics, Catholics against Protestants, French against Germans, North against South, greedy against more greedy. The Prince of the Palatinate was elected King of Bohemia, that's the eastern part of Czechoslovakia. The Holy Roman Emperor got very mad because this was his job. Traditionally, the king of the Austrian heir apparent became the king of Bohemia, and then the next thing you knew, he was Holy Roman Emperor when his father died. The Catholic states banded around the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Protestants were slow on the uptake. And consequently, the Catholics took Czechoslovakia, at least Bohemia, and ran the Prince of the Palatinate out, and he went back to England with his English wife, who was the English king's daughter. At this point, the Protestants were losing badly, so who comes in but Sweden, with a very powerful army, comes down and invades, and it goes back and forth. Catholic France joins Protestant Sweden, because they want part of Germany, and the armies march back and forth, north and south, east and west, and every time they go through Alsace and the Palatinate, they loot, they pillage, they rape. Why? Because they're not getting paid. When they join the army, they get anything they can steal. They're provided with food as long as generally they get it off the land. And they steal the farmer's blind. So the history of that area during the 30 Years' War is not a very pleasant thing to read. At the end of it, They reckon that Alsace and the Palatinate have lost between 30 and 60% of their people. Sometimes experts rate it as high as 90%. But what happened, when the armies came through, the civilians got the hell out of the way, and they went to the next town or the next country, and they may never have come back, or if so, only years later. Now, while these places were constantly being depopulated by armies, the neutral countries like Switzerland were getting overpopulated because it was too expensive in men and money to try to take Switzerland, so nobody bothered. Consequently, you get too many people in Switzerland, too little property, and one of their great exports was troops. They could raise regiments that they could farm out to foreign countries. This got rid of their excess public population. It gave the chaps something to do, and the Swiss soldiers were almost constantly employed in foreign armies. When the wars were over, these depopulated countries pleaded with places like Switzerland to supply them with farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, anybody who could do constructive work. And this is why you get a large number of people who are Palatines or Alsatians who are actually descendants of Swiss who've come into their countries to repopulate and develop. In Alsace, you got, there were also religious persecutions in Switzerland. In the Catholic cantons, you get Protestants being persecuted, and vice versa. So the Catholics flee to the southern part of Alsace, which is Catholic. The Protestant refugees flee to the north of Alsace, which is generally Protestant. Unfortunately, as far as we can figure out, the first Rook to go into southern Alsace was Protestant, and he got in the Catholic country, so he very quickly had to move north into the Protestant half. And it's very difficult to trace his movements. We've got up now to the period about 1800. I'm still talking about the groups who, I've just finished talking about the groups who came up as United Empire Loyalists. About 1800, we have the group of Pennsylvania Dutch, the late Pennsylvania Dutch, and the Mennonites, who came to the Kitchener-Waterloo area, and I think they're probably the best known Germans in Canada. Then there was a third cluster of, a second cluster of German settlers came from Hanover, South Germany, and Switzerland. These came in 1794 through New York. They came into Fort Erie and Chippewa, but they eventually ended up in Markham Township near Toronto. And the leader of that expedition and his people are now becoming recognized as co-founders of the Toronto area. Thirdly, during the troubles leading up to the War of 1812, Britain again had to employ foreign troops to augment her own forces in Canada. There were 2 regiments of Swiss soldiers sent here, the de Meuron and the de Watteville, and after the war, many of these people stayed. And I should mention that the Hessians and these Alsatians, the ones who settled in Quebec, married into French families, and you now find a good many that they have been French-speaking for years, and their names will have changed and become sort of Francisized. I got a call from a chap in Hull, just across the river from us in Ottawa. His name was Arbique, A-R-B-I-Q-U-E. He said, I am a descendant of a Hessian. I said, well, that doesn't sound like a German name. He said, no, my ancestor's name was Harbeke, H-A-R-B-E-K-E, but he's now Arbique. In the 1830s, we had conditions forcing or encouraging people to emigrate, and these cycles reoccur. So every so often when you get a depression, you'll get people coming out from Europe. And there are occasions when these depressions are worse than usual. That's when you get most. And that's when our Alsatians came over. Whether in a few years of bad weather, of war, or crop failure, or famine, and you'll get them. The worst hit district in Alsace in the 1830s was the north part. Could you show that map again, please? Right up at the top of the shaded areas, up beyond the pointer there, way up there, right, that edge is a district of Bissenberg. It's about the size of a township. That little township lost 6,650 people in the 10 years during the Great Depression of the early 1830s. And we got our share of those people. Keep the map handy. I may need it again. So I have mentioned that the communist revolutions were the cause of many people, many Germanics especially, leaving their countries. And these people, in many cases, have been the backbone of economic, social, commercial, and industrial organization. Perhaps one thing I should have said at the beginning is that when people came across the ocean to North America, they didn't just jump on a ship and come across on a moment's notice. They generally met relatives, friends, neighbors in a depressed locality, and they would talk over this maybe for a year or two, over a winter, and get ready to sail in the spring or summer. They usually traveled in groups of about 30 families, and these families all came from the same locality. Especially when they knew they were coming to found a colony, a community that is, community of their own, where they would be able to depend upon each other. They had enough craftsmen with them, or diversity of trades, so that they could set up in a self-sufficient community. Blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, weavers, so that they really could supply themselves and not have to rely on local groups. But in the 20th century particularly, with so many single families and unattached people fleeing in masses, there was much less of this organization. Now, I want to hark back to Alsace and Lorraine. And since we have so many Alsatian immigrants, I'll look closer at the province. Alsace and Lorraine are the two distinct provinces which belong to France now. When Charlemagne died in 814, his empire was divided, and one of his grandsons, the eldest of the grandsons, got a territory in the center here. Not quite that wide, but it ran north and south. It was quite extensive that way. In turn, this was Lothar, Emperor Lothar. Lothar gave a chunk in the middle here along the Rhine River to his son Lothar. And today that a good part of that remains, and the western part of it, on the west of the Vosges Mountains, is called after Lothar, Lorraine. The German word for Lorraine is Lotharingen. Lotharingen. Comes directly from that, and the French have softened it. To the east of the Vosges Mountains, between the Vosges and the Rhine, is Alsace, and it's named after its largest river, the Ill. In German, it's called Alsace. Now, Lorraine is French-speaking, largely. Alsace is largely German-speaking, with a sizable Protestant minority. It's never been independent, and it's always been warred over, but it was a part of the Holy Roman Empire until the 17th century, when the Germans, the French rather, because of their overwhelming power, wangled a treaty with the emperor by which the emperor was saving face, and he thought, I'll get this back later. But the French had other ideas, and by the terms of the contract, they eventually took over the whole of Alsace. And this, of course, made the Germans and the emperor hopping mad, and they've been angry about it ever since. And the Germans have taken it back at least twice, or 3 times, but it always reverted to France. And the Germans have a peculiar attitude toward this. It belongs to them, and they're going to have it. And the people there are German-speaking, and they're Germans, and they'll welcome us with open arms when we come in with our guns. And they treat them just like other Germans, high-handed, authoritarian, and the Alsatians, people in Luxembourg, they don't like it, and they're happy to see the Germans go when they get kicked out. They go on speaking German, but they liked being where they are. The people who came to settle in our townships were generally farmers. And here, this is the difference between the migration where they found themselves in a completely different situation from that which they left. The land here is mostly flatter. The farms are larger and spread widely apart. There is little or no menace from enemy armies. Going back to Michael Gonder again, in 1976 he wrote Willoughby of Lincoln and Welland counties. He wrote a short section on Willoughby Township, and he says that around about the year 1830, large numbers of Germans began coming into Willoughby, and they leased or bought land, maybe plots of 50 acres. A lot of it was completely virgin soil and largely forested, and all this had to be cleared before they could farm. He then goes on to say some of them prospered so much that they bought up to 200 acres. I want to go back and describe now the old country, because we know what it looks like here in Willoughby, and nobody can tell us much about it. But back home in the places they lived, the villages were ages old, and the farmers did not live dispersed across the countryside the way we are. They lived clustered together in tight little villages, very old villages, because they needed the protection of each other from the bands of robbers and invading soldiers. And as I've said, there was often no difference between robbers and troops, especially when the troops were not paid. Again, I've said how bad things were in the 30 Years' War. That little township I showed you of Wissembourg had 393 people before the war. At the end of the war, there were only 20 people left. And in one village I know of, Lapislak, there was nobody at all. Could I have the postcards, please? That's the village of Lapislak. Now has 700 people in it. And it happens to be the village from which I think several of the families came to Willoughby, emigrated from. I know the Rooks did. It's a typical village. It's not the most prosperous place, but this area of North Alsace is the least prosperous part of the country. It's very much off the beaten track, very much out of the way, and consequently it's retained a lot of its charm and picturesqueness. You can see the village church up there in the background, and the wooded slopes. Some of these farmers, in the wintertime when they can't work their farms, they go up the hills and are employed in timbering. I think there's another village. Okay, that's fine. Next village is a little more prosperous, a little more colorful in this case. It's a village about 5 or 6 miles away from Lapislak. Again, church sticks out. And, I should have mentioned that there are a great many half-timber houses in there. And it's very difficult to know the ages of these half-timber houses. This is a typical street in Lapislak. You can see it's very narrow and winding. This next one is the ancestral home of the Rooks, of the Rooks of Lapislak, and not our branch of the family. You can see it looks massive, but the only thing that's massive in it, besides the construction, I think, is the attic, because it's where they store vegetables and things like that, and it's quite a large attic under a tile roof. This is the side view of another Rook house, and that entranceway you saw vines hanging across, those are grapevines, and of course they make their own white wine. This is an interior view of the courtyard looking toward the house. You can see there's a wall closing this side that you can drive into. The ceilings aren't very high, as you can see. The rooms are small because it's easy to heat in the wintertime. This is the other side of the courtyard. You can see his tractor, his car, and those sheds for cattle and grain and so on. A lot of these houses are built around courtyards. This is Philip Rook's family. Just above the heads of the mother and the boy there, you can see little green things hanging on the timbers. They're wooden shoes hanging with the hole upward, and there are geraniums planted in them. Sherry said, "Oh, how quaint, you know. Where did you get the old wooden shoes?" And Louise said, "Well, they got worn out from wearing around the yard here, so I just hung them up there." So they wear these things in sloppy conditions still. This is a bandsman. My cousin Philip plays a tube in a band. That's not him, but that's what he would look like if he were. These are important features of village life. The brass band and the volunteer fire department. Philip is a member of the volunteer fire department, and that's his joy and pride. Ran through those very quickly. Perhaps I could show, just out of this little book, there are about 3 pictures in there. I can show a big town. Actually, the capital, Strasbourg. Oh, the first one is the cathedral. Cathedral and then the Kammerzell. That's the cathedral in Strasbourg. As you can see, it never got finished. The other tower never emerged. It was Catholic, and then it was Protestant. And I think it's Catholic again now. You can go on to the next. It's regarded as one of the great landmarks of Gothic architecture and of German architecture. The typical Alsatian big house construction, by big house I mean castle, palace, is red sandstone. This is Alsatian half timber construction from about 300 or 400 years ago, taken as about as far as you can take it. Enormous number of dormers and stories for a half-timber house. That's going some. Strasbourg is the capital of Alsace, and it's the seat of the European Economic Council, or is it? No, Parliament. These are the ruins of Castle Fleckenstein. The barons of Fleckenstein had power over this particular area of Wissembourg in the north. And again, it was destroyed during the 30 Years' War. When the French came through German territory, they blew up everything in sight that might threaten them in the future. This is a village religious procession. And the girl's basic costume is red. Red tends to be used to identify a Catholic costume, green for the Protestants. I've never found out why. But in village, when they put on their folk costume, that's the way you generally recognize them. That's it. Okay. Oh, and speaking of, again, of the half-timber houses, it's very difficult, unless you have old tax returns, to know when one of those houses was built. The first one I showed you that I said was the ancestral home of the Lapislak Rooks is the birthplace of an admiral, and we know that he was born there in 1804. So that house is, I would say, at least 200 years old. That kind of construction has been going on for 400 or 500 years. And I have a book here, which anyone can look at later, about that kind of construction. And the Swiss, when they came in, got it down to a fine art. And they could prefabricate these houses. They used natural timber and anything that was shaped, they would use for a particular purpose. All the numbers they knew, they had, just like a jigsaw puzzle, they had numbers on all the pieces. And they could cut it in a yard, cart it to a site, and put it up in a matter of hours. But the rest of it took a lot of time. I'll get right down to it. I don't have much more, if you'll have a little patience with me. Now, various communities, various provinces in the Germanic lands have grudges against each other, and they also have stereotypes. They used to say that a typical Bavarian, if there was a disaster, the typical Bavarian would go home and shoot himself. A typical Austrian would go home and get drunk. A typical German would go home and eat sausage. So the German Rhinelander is called Hans Wurst, Jack Sausage. Typical Alsatian is called Hans im Schnuckelloch. And schnorkel is the same as the word we use for snorkel. It means the long proboscis. And there it means mosquito. So Hans im Schnuckelloch is Jack in Skeeter Hollow. And there's a song about him because they figure that the Alsatian is a spoiled, moody fellow. And this is how it goes. Der Hans im Schnuckelloch hat alles, was will, und was hat, das will nicht, und was will, das hat nicht. Der Hans im Schnuckelloch hat alles, was will. And in case you didn't follow it, I'll give a translation. This Hans im Schnuckelloch has everything he wants, and what he has, he doesn't want, and what he wants, he doesn't have. So Hans im Schnuckelloch has everything he wants. Just a last thing about grudges. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many Swabians invaded Alsace, where they became very unpopular. And the expression, which lasted right into the 20th century, is, "Du verdammte Schwab," you damned Swabian. And just like that, in Pennsylvania, where a lot of German soldiers who fought against the rebels and settled later were called "Du verdammte Hess," you damned Hessian. And so on and so it goes. I think I'd better wind up now. Any of you would like to read about researching ancestry, I'll leave this with Mark. And I think possibly any questions? Is there time for that? Any questions? What? I'm delighted. I knew I had to say something about the Rooks or get lynched. Thank you very much.
Ted, on behalf of the entire group that's here tonight, I know they all want to express their appreciation to you for this very interesting and enjoyable evening that we have had. There's an awful lot of things I never knew anything about here, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people here in the same category. As a little remembrance of your time here with us tonight, one of our 1989 calendars that we hope you will treasure and be able to show. And one other thing that you will be able to wear is, after 40 some odd years, we'll even give you a Willoughby pin.
Well, bless you all.
Thanks again, Dave. Now we're going to invite you to stay around while a bit of lunch is prepared, and I'm sure you want to look at some of these other things that Ted has here. Incidentally, if any of you want to see what this fellow looked like 46 years ago and see his chubby little sister, we have Jim Potter has a picture back here. Don't forget Jackie's 50-50.